a lot of famous game developers in the industry. People that you know, people whose games you've played, people that you've probably seen time and time again and are aware of, that you know how important they have been to the evolution of video games. But some today are not as well known. And these are the top 7 game developers we owe a lot to, but may not know so well. A show dedicated to those people that have sort of had a big influence on the gaming world. People that shaped it, molded it, allowed it to become what it is today, sought to improve it at every turn, and for the most part have succeeded. And yet today are not remembered, mostly because what they did happened so many years ago. And perhaps the influence of what they did reached a level of ubiquity that makes you unable to understand how something could exist without it. So although we still owe a lot to people like Peter Molyneux, Sid Meier, Warren Spector, Julian Gollop, Will Wright, David Brabham, John Smedley, Chris Sawyer, Brian Fargo, Richard Garrett, and many, many more, these are people that you probably know. So let's shine a light on the people that maybe you're not as familiar with. That being said, let's get it started with number 7, Nasir Gebelli. If you're a fan of Final Fantasy, you know this name. You have to know it. Because the early Final Fantasy games and the early Secret of Mana games were made by him. Yes, they were designed by Square, but the person that put the code, the person that made the code, was Nasir Gebelli. And the way he programmed wasn't your usual write things down and then put them in the computer. No, what he did was program things in assembly from a memory. He would just sit down at a computer, start typing, and about a month later a game would come out. No listings, no comments, no high-level languages, just fundamental assembly code. And before that, before Square, before Final Fantasy, he also produced a lot of games for Serious Software and for his own company, Gebelli Software. That was between 1980 and 1983. Over the course of those 3 years, he produced about 15 video games. Or at least, that's how many you'd find on his Wikipedia page. According to John Romero, he made about 50 video games. Though he may have been exaggerating, still, 50 made head-to-toe by him. Written instruction by instruction directly into the memory of the Apple II computer. Number 6, Paul Neurath. If you ever want to blame someone for creating the first-person immersive experience you keep finding in games, blame him. He came up with the basic idea, and with the help of a fellow game developer, Doug Church, and a couple of other very, very smart people over at Blue Sky, like Warren Spector, they made Ultima Underworld. He came up with the idea of the dungeon sim by taking one of the core concepts of Ultima, which was living in a actual game world where not everything was centered around the player, where characters existed as their own entities with their own jobs and their own preoccupations, and you could interact with them, you could shape what happens, but it still felt like the world was there and you were visiting it, not that it was made just so you would be there and destroy everybody you see. And to that, he added the concepts of a flight simulator, namely that everything exists. You exist, you as a character, you exist to a point where you even have a collision detection system that bounces you off walls if you jump into them, where arrows are actual projectiles, where every door can be broken, where everything is rendered to a first-person perspective that puts you right in the middle of the action, right in the middle of that world. And that idea continued with System Shock and Thief, and it spread like wildfire through the industry until we got Deus Ex, Dishonored, Bioshock, and everything else. Even Skyrim, even Bethesda's most valuable works are based upon Paul Neurath's design. Number 5, Ken and Roberta Williams. Without them, we would not have adventure games. Together, they formed Sierra Online, the company responsible for birthing the adventure gaming genre. Games where you would run around in different locations, exploring, using various items with various other items in increasingly unrecognizable and completely mad ways in order to solve some puzzle, in order to get past some obstacle. What started with something simple like Mystery House would soon turn into one of the most important games ever made, King's Quest. The one that solidified what an adventure game could be. Not just a series of static screens, but an actual world that you explore, through which you could move, one that you could see, one that you could touch, one that you could enjoy. Number 4, Daniela Bunten Berry. The name will probably not ring a bell with many people, but to those who have played Mule, this name means a lot. Daniel Bunten Berry was one of the key developers of Mule, responsible for a lot of the characteristics that made this game so unique, like the real-time auction component. In the year 1983, not long after war games themselves were becoming a thing, someone came up with the idea of the opposite of a war game. A game that was still about conflict, a game that was still about competition, strategic competition, but not about war. Instead, it was about economy, and not just any kind of economy, one that would encourage people at a certain level to not screw each other over completely, because if they did, the colony would fail, but instead to find a way to work together and still manage to screw each other over. It's a sense of cooperative competition which gave us a glimpse into what games could offer us, what variety of gameplay diversity you could find in a video game. Sadly, Daniel Bunten Berry passed away in 1998 of lung cancer while still working on an online version of Mule. Such versions exist nowadays, and different versions and different names. And it wasn't just Mule. She also made a game entitled 7 Cities of Gold instead of making a direct adaptation of a board game called Civilization. Yet still, that 7 Cities of Gold was still a source of inspiration for the video game called Civilization, the one made by Sid Meier. Number 3. Richard Bartle and Roy Trubshaw. They made Mud. They made the MMO. They made a game where people from all around the world, no matter who they were, no matter what they were, would join one big online world where they could become anything they wished to be, where they could be who they actually were but couldn't in the real world, where they could learn, where they could socialize, where they could interact with other people, and then grow as a person. Their contribution to video games cannot be understated, and the intention with which they made Mud is one of the greatest things you'll ever hear about, which is why I encourage you to look up the Dark Age of the MMO show on this channel. It's a bit long-winded, but it's the long-form explanation of why Richard Bartle and Roy Trubshaw are some of the most important game developers that ever existed. Apart from, without them you would not be playing World of Warcraft now, or just about any other MMO. Number 2. Chris Crawford. As I've mentioned a few minutes ago, in the year 1983, war games were just becoming a thing. And you know who you have to thank because they became a thing? Chris Crawford, who wrote a game called Legionnaire for the Commodore PET in 1979. But the word that would solidify what a war game is would have been Eastern Front, released in 1981. It has been described as the first of its kind to be able to match pen and paper war games. And mind you that this, the creation of a gaming genre, is just a footnote to what he did. He founded the Game Developers Conference. He set out to create games that offered breadth, not just depth. Games that will give you experiences which you will not be able to get in real life. Games that will give you experiences like no other games can. He made video games about the balance of power between East and West in the nuclear Cold War, in which the main objective was to not start an actual war, but do your best to use diplomacy as a means to resolve all conflicts, all situations. And that was in 1985. Hell, in 1983 he made a game called Gossip about social interaction, one that is still described as having a level of complexity in the way that you interacted with characters and characters interacted between them as The Sims does. And he kept on chasing that dragon. That elusive game, one that would let you experience an actual conversation, actual interaction with characters in a video game that will not take you out of the experience. It will make you believe that this is an actual person. Video games where story and gameplay are not a separate thing, where they don't happen in different stages but are melded into the same element. His last GDC speech, the Dragon speech, is one of the greatest things you will hear. After that speech, he left the video games industry and tried for 24 years to make that game, one that will let you interact with a story in a digital environment, and not just in the way you do in most video games today where you just choose a dialogue option and a scripted response occurs. No, but an actual story with actual characters that you actually interact with and that react to you. And 24 years later, he is still working at it with very little in the way of resources. Number 1. William Higginbotham. Although Ralph Baer is recognized as the father of video games, being the one that created the concept of the video game console, being the one that made the first one, the actual physical first one, we also have to thank William Higginbotham for creating one of the first, if not the actual first, known interactive video game, Tennis for Two. William Higginbotham was one of the people responsible for creating the first nuclear bomb. And also he created this game, this simple game that spread like wildfire through the imagination of everyone that saw it. So many possibilities unlocked by him. And yet he did not wish to become involved in the video games industry or in video games altogether. His life's work was stopping the spread of nuclear bombs, nuclear non-proliferation. But unwittingly, he helped spread something else. He helped spread video games, their idea, their concept. And in a way, video games have helped spread his message. Games have the power to unite the world, to unite people. Regardless of where you are, you can always enjoy a video game. You can always find one that is just right for you, one that you can be happy with, one that you can share with others, one that will let you see the world in a better light, one in which everybody can live together in peace without the fear of nuclear weapons. Well, that would be it for this top 7 game developers we owe a lot to. You can be sure there are many, many more that deserve a mention, but I'm gonna leave that to you. In the comments, please leave the name of a game developer that influenced you, that made a game so good, so enjoyable, so awe-inspiring that it made you think about something which you would not have thought about otherwise. And not just uninstalling the game because you're playing League of Legends or Counter-Strike Go, and suddenly that human unity thing doesn't seem to be working out quite as well, does it? But still, I'm curious to see what you come up with. Goodbye.
Thank you for watching this show. If you enjoyed it, please consider watching some of our other videos and maybe sharing them or giving a thumbs up if you feel like it. And if you really liked what you saw, please check out our Patreon page. For just $1 a month, you could help us make much better shows and get some rewards in the process. Or you could consider buying my book called Tale of Doom. Volume 1 is out now and available for just $2. And as always, if you thought it was horrible, you know where to find me and complain about it.